60 years and still going strong. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainly Movies. Today is James Bond Day. And not just any James Bond Day, but the 60th James Bond Day. That's right, 60 years ago today, on October 5th, 1962, Dr. No premiered in London and forever changed the espionage genre. To commemorate 60 years of Bond, today I'm going to be ranking all 27 films in the James Bond franchise, as part of both my 007 video series and my franchise Rankography series. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. So, what is a rankography exactly? Well, it's my ranking of a filmography, whether that be a director's output, an actor's appearances, or even an entire franchise. My rankographies are based on personal preference, and I rank movies according to how much I enjoyed them, rather than any sort of specific technical merit or attribute. Remember, this is just my ranking, not the ranking, so be sure to post your own personal ranking of the James Bond franchise in the comments below. It's not often that you come across a character as universally recognized and beloved as James Bond, or a franchise as successful and long-lived as 007. This film franchise has been going for 60 years now, with 25 films in the Eon Productions series and 2 unofficial non-Eon films, for a total of 27 movies. In the 6-decade-long history of this franchise, the longest we've ever gone between Bond movies is 6 years. This franchise has been an enduring and consistent part of pop culture for several generations now. We've had 6 different actors play Bond, and twice as many different directors, each bringing something unique to the series. 60 years have cemented Bond as an indelible part of cinema history, but he and this franchise are far from done. I've already reviewed all 27 Bond films and ranked the films within each of the 6 Bond eras, so if you want to check those videos out for some more in-depth thoughts on each of the films, you can click right here for my entire 007 playlist. I'll also put a link to the playlist and all of the individual videos in the description below, along with some affiliate links in case you're interested in buying any of these Bond movies. Alright, let's get this rankography started. Coming in at number 27, Casino Royale, the 1967 version. So it's probably not super surprising or original to put this movie at the bottom of the Bond pile, considering it's one of the 2 non-Eon produced films. This movie is a spoofy take on James Bond, released in the midst of the 60s success of the official series, but having zero connection to it, other than capitalizing on its popularity. In almost all cases, I can find something positive to say about a movie, at least some aspect that I enjoyed or appreciated. Well, I thought the theme song was okay. This is just an utterly baffling, incoherent film. It's got a random, supremely disjointed story, it's way too long, and it's remarkably dull. With a spoof, you'd at least expect it to be entertaining, but this isn't even fun in a dumb way. Casino Royale 67 is barely a movie, let alone a James Bond movie. Coming in at number 26, Never Say Never Again. I know, how original, putting both of the non-Eon produced films at the bottom of the list, but I just can't justify putting either of them above even my least favorite Eon film. I will say that Never Say Never Again is significantly better than Casino Royale 67, but that doesn't mean it's good. Frankly, this is a very strange film. Whereas Casino Royale tried to put a spoofy comedic spin on Bond, this one at least has the facade of being a typical 007 film, going as far as casting Sean Connery in the role of Bond 12 years after his last appearance in Diamonds Are Forever. But this isn't a typical 007 film. Like Casino Royale 67, it has no connection to the rest of the series, and so its attempts to be like the rest of the series come across incredibly hollow. It's a film without identity, made worse by a messy, dull story that simply adapts the previously made Thunderball. There's something comforting and nostalgic about seeing Connery as James Bond again, but it's not enough to save this movie. Coming in at number 25, Die Another Day. This is the 20th film in the main series, marking the first Bond movie of the 21st century and the 4th and final of the Pierce Brosnan era. It also just so happens to be my least favorite of the official Bond movies. This film has got some bizarre tonal inconsistencies. Aside from a strange addition to the classic gun barrel opening, this film actually starts off decently well. It's got some stakes and a situation that we'd never seen before in the franchise, but quickly and jarringly transitions from a gritty POW story to a glossy super satellite fantasy action flick. It's a strange mix and has a very absurd storyline, but considering this was the 20th film released on the 40th anniversary of Bond, it's clear that some effort was put into referencing and paying homage to the rest of the franchise, including some of the goofier entries. There's some fun to be had with the Easter eggs, but unfortunately, the over the top story, and especially the awful and imposing CGI, draw most of the focus. There's been a lot of ridiculous moments in this franchise over the years, but the almost entirely CGI shot of Bond parasailing on a tidal wave caused by a calving glacier is easily the most absurd. Coming in at number 24, Thunderball. This is the fourth film in the series, and I feel like my low placement of this movie is probably one of the more controversial, unpopular opinions I have with this franchise. I know a lot of people really like this movie, but I just don't get it. Chronologically, it's the first real misstep in the franchise for me, but there really isn't one big issue that pushes this one down. It's a bunch of small things that add up. All of the previous Bond movies had their slow moments, but were still engaging adventures overall. Thunderball is just a dull slog to get through, starting off slow and then never ramping up to anything. It's also one of the most murky, drab films in the series, which is quite the feat with its Caribbean setting. The film makes use of extensive underwater photography, with numerous and lengthy scuba sequences. The novelty and technical considerations for these scenes was impressive for the era, and they're fun to watch for a few minutes, but they just tediously drag on, only further adding to the slow pace and painful dullness of the film. Coming in at number 23, For Your Eyes Only. This is the 12th film in the Bond series, and officially my least favorite of the Roger Moore era. This is another one that I think most people don't have much of a problem with, but it's always stood out to me as a strange outlier. The Moore-era Bond films were frequently quite goofy, playing up Roger Moore's inherent humor. Moonraker was an especially goofy entry in the series, and I think there was concern that they had perhaps gone too far, and so this follow-up film was an attempted course correction. Unfortunately, I think it was an overcorrection. There's still some Moore-era fun, including a whole winter sports menagerie and some decent action, but the overall story is a little self-serious and lacking cohesion. Much of it feels like a series of random, disjointed scenes, no matter how many times I watch it. I also have to mention that this has the worst title sequence of any Bond movie, being the only one to visually feature the singer actually singing the theme song. I really wish Blondie had won the bid for this one. Coming in at number 22, The World Is Not Enough. Okay, so we're already jumping back to the Brosnan era with this 19th film in the franchise. For me, this has always been one of the most forgettable films in the franchise. I don't think it's awful. It's not a chore to sit through or anything, but it just kind of exists. The first half of the story is decent, and I think the Elektra plotline is kind of interesting, but all of that gets pushed to the background to introduce the near unanimously despised Christmas Jones. I know people have various gripes with this character, but for me, she just doesn't add anything to the story. Instead, actually drawing focus away from more interesting characters and plot lines. The action's pretty bombastic here, which can be enjoyable in a popcorn movie kind of way, but it gets repetitive after a while, and counterintuitively, boring as a result. Again, this isn't a movie I hate or anything, it's just a generically forgettable dud to close out the century. Coming in at number 21, You Only Live Twice. This is the 5th film in the franchise, and the final Connery movie before his first short Bond break. This movie is certainly a step up from the painfully dull Thunderball, but not a particularly big step. It is, however, not a dull film. It actually starts off pretty strongly, with a shocking cold opening and enjoyable first half, but then devolves into ridiculousness. There had been some silly aspects to earlier Bond films, but this is definitely the goofiest of the Connery era. Some of it works, like the fun gadgets and ridiculous volcano lair, complete with piranha pool, but other aspects really don't work. Most notably, the ninja school and the asinine turn Bond Japanese subplot. What begins as a silly little concept quickly turns uncomfortable and confusing, not to mention entirely useless for the plot. It's a befuddling movie, but at least it's not a dull one. Coming in at number 20, Octopussy. This 13th film in the series certainly takes the prize for worst named Bond movie. I know it's a pretty superficial and inconsequential thing to be bothered by, but man is it awful. Luckily, the film itself is a bit better than its title suggests. This one seems to serve as a course correction to the course correction that was For Your Eyes Only. It never reaches the off-the-rails goofy heights of Moonraker, but this film sees the return of some of Moore's trademark silliness and humor. It also sees the return of a semi-cohesive plot, with an interesting and engaging story, even if it does take a bit of a weird turn when the circus rolls into town. A few too many clowns for my taste, but the action and fun story are enough to keep this one enjoyable. Just avoid typing it into Google if you can help it. Coming in at number 19, Quantum of Solace. This is the 22nd film in the Bond series, and my lowest ranked movie from the Daniel Craig era. This one gets a lot of hate, and while I don't think it's necessarily unfair, I do think it tends to be a bit exaggerated. Obviously, I don't think this is a particularly good movie with its placement, but I think it appears a lot worse than it actually is, because it had to follow Casino Royale. The drop in quality from Casino Royale to Quantum of Solace is kind of baffling. This one picks up immediately after the events of Casino Royale, but isn't able to maintain the emotion, story momentum, or even characterization of Bond. It's got the most underwhelming villain of the Craig era, and although it's a very action-packed movie, opts for spectacle over story significance. Really, this movie just feels like a stepping stone, providing us with some relevant information, but mostly just filler in order to get us from Casino Royale to Skyfall and the larger Craig era arc. Coming in at number 18, Diamonds Are Forever. This is the 7th Bond film and marks Sean Connery's first return to the role. So, if you couldn't tell, I'm not the biggest fan of the later films of the Connery era, but I will say that my lack of enthusiasm for this film is less due to disliking it and more due to not really having much to latch onto and like about it. The plot is pretty standard Bond, and it gets a bit convoluted, but it's okay in general. It's also got quite the set of secondary characters. One thing that always stands out about this one, though, is how unbelievably campy it is. It's not as goofy as Connery's previous film, You Only Live Twice, but the campiness is off the charts. As with his second return 12 years later in Never Say Never Again, there's something comforting but slightly off about having Connery back as Bond. Honestly, I would have liked more Lazenby Bond films, or at least a proper story follow-up to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, rather than this disappointingly episodic entry that doesn't acknowledge the events of the previous film at all. Coming in at number 17, A View to a Kill. Okay, following up Connery's last official Bond film with Moore's last film and this 14th entry in the franchise. I know most people will put this at the bottom of the Moore pile, and maybe at or close to the bottom of the overall franchise pile, but there's just something weirdly enjoyable about this one for me. It's baffling, yet entertaining, which seems to be a bit of a trend for this franchise. A View to a Kill is a very odd mix of a film. It's got some surprisingly brutal stuff, but then counterbalances that with a goofy yet refreshing villain scheme and two of the most cartoonish villains in the series, Max Zorin and Mayday. It has an unbelievably annoying Bond girl, and Roger Moore's age is definitely starting to show through. But despite the random, cobbled-together feel of the story, it's strangely rewatchable. Coming in at number 16, Tomorrow Never Dies. Whew, this 18th film in the Bond series means that 3 of the 4 Brosnan-era Bonds are in the bottom 40% of the franchise for me. Luckily, though, we've hit the point in the ranking where I at least generally like all of the rest of the movies. Tomorrow Never Dies was the first Bond movie to be released after the start of the Mission Impossible film series, and there's definitely a competitive one-upping vibe at play here. It's overly tech-based, like all of the Brosnan era films, and it feels more like a typical late 90s action tech thriller than a Bond movie, but somehow it still works. Dated elements aside, I would argue that this film might even work better today than it did when it was first released, thanks to the surprising prescience of the villain scheme. What really elevates this film for me, though, is Michelle Yeoh's Wei Lin. She's easily one of the best Bond girls in the franchise, not only important to the actual plot of the film, but also incredibly skilled. No damsel in distress here, just some awesome action and fight choreography. Coming in at number 15, Moonraker. This is the 11th Bond movie, and one of the most frequently maligned films of the franchise, which probably makes its fairly central placement in my ranking a bit of a hot take. But honestly, this movie isn't nearly as bad as its reputation would have you believe, as long as you know what you're getting yourself into. If you go in expecting a serious espionage thriller, you're gonna be sorely disappointed. But if you go in expecting ridiculous, goofy campiness, you're bound to have a good time. For a movie called Moonraker, there's really not all that much moonraking. The shark and planet jumping trip to space is a fairly minimal part of the film, but that's probably for the best considering how comparatively dull that section of the movie is. Luckily, the first two-thirds of the film are decent. Again, with the right mindset and mental preparation, resulting in an utterly ridiculous but exceptionally fun Moore-era ride. Coming in at number 14, The Man with the Golden Gun. This is the 9th Bond film and Roger Moore's second outing. This is also the Bond movie that's improved the most for me on rewatch. Obviously, I still only put it in the middle of the pack, but if I had done a ranking after the first watch all those years ago, this would have been down with the likes of Thunderball. To be honest, I'm not quite sure why this one gets the most improved trophy. It was incredibly dull to me the first time, and while it's certainly a more serious toned film than many of Moore's later movies, it's still interesting and has more than its fair share of ridiculous elements. The Man with the Golden Gun does suffer from some bad secondary characters. The frustratingly inept Bond girl, Mary Goodnight, not to mention the infuriating return of J.W. Pepper, but it's also got one of the best and most underrated villains in Scaramanga. He seems gimmicky at first, with the Golden Gun and Funhouse Lair, but he's one of Bond's most evenly matched foes, acting as essentially a dark mirror to Bond. Coming in at number 13, Spectre. We're moving into the top half of this ranking with the 24th film in the franchise. And what better movie to put in the middle of the ranking than one of the most middle-of-the-road Bond films? Much like Quantum of Solace earlier in the Craig era, this film was in a tough spot, coming on the heels of an extraordinarily strong entry in the franchise. This position was made even more difficult for Spectre, because it was forced into a cleanup role. Skyfall largely concluded a multi-film story arc, which meant that Spectre was essentially a mid-era reset, a tacked-on afterthought put in to tie up loose ends and bridge the gap to a new story. As a result, this film is plagued by periodic dullness, but it does introduce two new, or semi-new players into the mix, the reluctant Bond girl, Madeline Swan, and the throwback villain Blofeld. It's certainly more a movie of revelations and setup than anything else, but is still decent, kept exciting by a handful of strong action sequences. Coming in at number 12, Dr. No. This is the film that started it all. Bond #1, released 60 years ago today. I've gotta admit, this franchise is a little strange for me, because usually when I do a ranking, the first movie is more often than not at or very close to the top. Having it in the number 12 position is basically unheard of. As I mentioned before, we're well into the portion of this ranking where I genuinely enjoy all of the films, but this one always seems like an underwhelming and strange start to the franchise for me. Maybe it's because of all the films to follow, Maybe it's because of the slow third act and the unexpectedly fantastical story developments, but every time I watch this movie, I can't help but be struck by the fact that this was the first glimpse people got of Bond, and of the eventual franchise. The story may be a bit underwhelming, but this film did establish many of the Bond cliches and traditions that we still know and love today. Plus, it introduced us to our first and arguably most iconic James Bond, Sean Connery. Coming in at number 11, The Living Daylights. This is the 15th film in the franchise, and it's not only the first film of the Timothy Dalton era, but also the first Dalton era film in this rankography. The introduction of our fourth Bond not only provided us with another different take on the character, but also a significant shift and course correction for the franchise. I've never been particularly sold on Dalton's brand of Bond, but his serious action star style definitely worked well with this franchise tonal shift and espionage-driven action. Previous Bond films had good action sequences, but they were just that, sequences. The Living Daylights is an action movie, probably the first Bond movie that could really be given that designation. This film's hindered by a convoluted plot and unnecessarily complex villain scheme, but somehow it still has a good and engaging story, making it one of the best first films in the franchise. Coming in at number 10, License to Kill. This is the 16th James Bond film and was the second and final movie of the Dalton era. So, Dalton was one of the last Bonds to make it into this ranking, but the first to be completely knocked out. I gave License to Kill the slight edge here, but the two Dalton films are among the most consistent in the franchise, so I could just as easily flip these two around. I'm still not completely sold on Dalton as Bond, but I do appreciate the continuation of the era's more serious, gritty tone. In fact, I would say that this was the darkest Bond film up to that point, and although we've had plenty of rogue Bond storylines since, the straightforward simplicity of a Bond revenge tale really worked here. It's got some physically and emotionally brutal moments, and although Bond's vendetta seems a little out of the blue here, the hinted at connections to On Her Majesty's Secret Service makes for a satisfying, albeit delayed, follow-up to the most emotional Bond film prior to the Craig era. Coming in at number 9, Live and Let Die. This is the 8th Bond film overall, and the first of the Roger Moore era. This was a tumultuous time in the Bond franchise. There had been 3 different Bonds in 3 movies across only 5 years. Roger Moore was our 3rd James Bond, and although he was quite different from both Connery and Lazenby, somehow this transition didn't feel too jarring. The final Connery-era film, Diamonds Are Forever, was very campy, but this movie set the bar and the tone for the Moore era, embracing its silliness and Moore's inherent humor from the get-go. This is a tonally inconsistent film, with a plot that's absolutely all over the place, but it's a very fun and enjoyable movie. In fact, it probably would have been higher in the ranking for me if it didn't have my all-time least favorite Bond character, Sheriff J.W. Pepper. Even the theme song is great, coming in second for my ranking of that. Coming in at number 8, No Time to Die. This is the 25th Bond film, serving as the 5th and final movie of the Craig era, and also our current most recent entry in the franchise. It's a very good, but not great, installment in the series, landing smack in the middle of my Craig era ranking. Although never reaching the highs of Casino Royale or Skyfall, this is definitely a step up from Spectre, and provides us with not only Daniel Craig's most emotional turn as Bond, but perhaps our best and most fitting conclusion to any Bond era. Safin is an underwhelming villain due to his poor utilization, and there are some odd story decisions at times, but this movie offers some impressive action sequences, as well as a number of bold, unexpected choices. There are quite a few Bond franchise firsts here, and this film left me excited to see what the future of 007 holds. Coming in at number 7, On Her Majesty's Secret Service. This is the 6th Bond film, and is the one and only movie of the George Lazenby era, making it the highest ranking first entry in this list for any Bond actor. After 5 films with Connery as 007, this film marked the first Bond transition. It doesn't seem as strange 53 years and 6 Bonds later, but the concept of swapping out an actor mid-franchise had to be a jarring one at the time. George Lazenby is quite different from Connery, but within minutes, he feels natural in the role. I actually really like Lazenby's Bond. He feels less like a caricature and more like a real person, imbuing a bit more emotion to the role than we had previously seen. The snowy Alps set story is a refreshing break from the string of beach bonds that came before it, and although the story's midsection drags a bit, this has a good and engaging plot, featuring one of the most shocking and impactful endings of any Bond movie. The worst part about this film is that we never got a proper follow-up. Coming in at number 6, GoldenEye. This is the 17th film in the Bond franchise, and marks not only the first film in the Pierce Brosnan era, but also my highest ranked movie of that era. GoldenEye was essentially a reset of a reset. This franchise had undergone a number of changes over the years, and quite a few course corrections and recorrections, but this film felt like a return to form. After the gritty action of the Dalton era, GoldenEye takes us back to the sleek, suave charm of early Bond by introducing Bond number 5, Pierce Brosnan. Although the techie, satellite-based plotline would grow tiresome by the end of the Brosnan era, the story here felt fresh and unique, as did the villain setup. GoldenEye was a big turning point in the franchise for a number of reasons, but one of the biggest contributions was the introduction of Judi Dench as M, a bold but exceptionally good casting decision that would span 2 Bond eras. Coming in at number 5, The Spy Who Loved Me. This is the 10th film in the franchise, and my highest ranked movie of the Roger Moore era. It may have taken him 3 movies, but Moore finally hits his stride here, balancing both his charm and humor to create a very likable and entertaining rendition of Bond. And it goes beyond just the character of Bond. The film itself is well balanced, beginning with one of the best opening sequences of the franchise, and continuing on with a solid but humorous and fun storyline. The villain is fairly forgettable, and the villainous plot is a touch overly familiar, but this film mixes things up to keep it interesting. After one of the most inept Bond girls in The Man with the Golden Gun, we get one of the strongest, with Agent XXX, who's not only skillful, but also has great chemistry with Bond. Plus, The Spy Who Loved Me features the second most iconic car in the Bond franchise. Coming in at number 4, From Russia with Love. This is only the 2nd film in the Bond franchise, but one of its biggest outliers. Only 2 movies in, and the franchise already shakes things up. After the semi-campy Dr. No, this film makes a shift towards the more serious. It actually has a lot of espionage elements to it, and is probably the most traditional spy thriller film in the franchise. Although it suffers from occasional pacing issues, it's much more consistent than its predecessor, and features one of the most solid stories in the whole franchise, not to mention both a strong villain and a fairly strong Bond girl. It may be one of the biggest outliers in the franchise, but this is the type of movie that comes to mind when you think of espionage thrillers. After only 2 years and 2 films, the 007 franchise had cemented itself and almost all of its tropes in pop culture. Coming in at number 3, Skyfall. We've finally made it into the home stretch with this 22nd film in the franchise. These top-ranked movies are all really close for me, so it's definitely hard to decide on the order. As with so many previous Bond actors, the 3rd film's stride returns, with Daniel Craig really feeling at home in this role, which is fortuitous considering how character-driven this movie is. It's got some excellent, purposeful action, and a truly engaging and earnest narrative, but this is about more than just espionage. It digs into Bond's backstory in a way we have never seen before, and ends up being both an exploration of his past and a character-driven examination of his present. This is easily the most compelling the character of Bond has ever been. After the startling misstep that was Quantum of Solace, Skyfall acted as an important and major recovery for the Craig era and the franchise. and this 50th anniversary movie is probably the most well-crafted and technically impressive Bond film we have. Coming in at number 2, Goldfinger. This is the third film in the franchise, and my highest ranked movie of the Sean Connery era. It may not have been the first Bond, but it was my first Bond, and I still think it's the ideal example of an early Bond film. It has the perfect balance of dramatic story and silly campiness, without ever going over the top like so many of the other films in the franchise. Once again, we see a third film stride, with Connery understanding who this character is and really nailing how to portray him in the midst of this film's unique tonal balance. We've also got a lot of other great characters in addition to Bond. Auric Goldfinger is a memorably big character, personality-wise, but he's also menacing, so there's this extra layer to him. Oddjob, Goldfinger's right hat man, is one of my favorite characters in this franchise, and this movie also features one of the best and most independent Bond girls in the series, despite her ridiculous name. And if all of that wasn't enough to put this into the upper echelon of Bond movies, it also features my favorite 007 theme song, belted out by the one and only Shirley Bassey. So that means my number 1 James Bond film is Casino Royale, the 2006 version. Kind of interesting and coincidental that my Bond rankography ended up being bookended by Casino Royale's. This second and far superior Casino Royale is the 21st film in the franchise, and was the first film in the Daniel Craig era. The first movie of any Bond era is always a bit of a reset, but the Craig era took it to the extreme. This isn't just a reset, it's a reboot. Casino Royale functions as a bit of an origin story for Bond, who's only just received his 00 designation. This new approach to the story also allowed for a new Bond characterization, delivered brilliantly by Daniel Craig. This version of Bond is still charming and funny, but he's physically imposing. He's also young and arrogant, something that sets up for the 5-film story and character arc of the era. Much like my number 2 Bond film, Casino Royale features a menacing villain, this time a little more subtly menacing, as well as one of the best Bond girls in the franchise, Vesper Lynd. The action's great, the story's engaging, and the characters are compelling, which all help to make this not only my favorite film of the Craig era, but of the entire franchise. Alright, so that's my rankography of the James Bond franchise. 27 movies, 60 years, and a whole lot of shaken, not stirred martinis. What does your ranking look like? I'd love to see some reasoning for your order, so be sure to post it in the comments below. Remember, I've already reviewed all 27 of these movies, and ranked the films of the 6 Bond eras, so you could check those videos out if you want some more in-depth discussion of each, as well as my ratings, pros and cons, and even tailored film recommendations. And if you're interested in buying any of these movies, I do have affiliate links to all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this rankography, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more videos like this, as well as movie reviews. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies, the way life should be.